Good morning, everyone. I just like to say thank you for this opportunity, and Lord willing, it'll go well. And thanks to Pastor Jeff. It's been wonderful to be here and be a part of this body that loves one another so well and genuinely cares about each other's day-to-day lives. And we do live day-to-day lives, do we not? It's not, yes, we have big things, but we also have a lot of big decisions to make. People around my age, we need to figure out college and stuff. And then there's career and house and family and all that stuff. And, when you get older, how long do you stay in your home? If you do need to move on to a nursing home, which one do you pick? Which one do you go to? How long do you stay? We have a lot of decisions that we have to make. And we do have to make them. We can't just sit and do nothing, because that's not life. That's just passive. But we live an active life. So, wouldn't it be nice to know what the Lord's will is for our lives? To know what exactly He wants us to do? Because there's a lot of things that the Bible doesn't explicitly talk about. It talks about principles, and those principles apply. Don't get me wrong. But, doesn't say, you shall move out of your house at this stage. It doesn't say, you shall go to this college and this major and marry this person, yada, 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 whatever. It doesn't say that. We have to make those decisions. Wouldn't it be nice, I know for me at least, it would be nice to know what the Lord's will is for those times and places and those decisions. But that begs a question, because if there is one will to know, how do we know it? How do we know what the Lord's will is for our lives? And while there's a lot of good actions you can take, what's most important is your heart posture, because if your heart isn't ready, then even if you do good things, like read the Word and pray and go to church, you won't receive anything. And so, Psalm 32 verse 8 tells us, I will instruct you and teach you in the way you should go. I will counsel you with my loving eye on you. So that's how we know what the Lord's will is. He's going to tell us. But again, how do we listen? Because we need to be willing to listen. Because if He tells us and we're not listening, then what good is that going to do? And so I think not the only example of this, but a fantastic example of how to listen is found in the book of Proverbs. There's a lot of good wisdom in this book. One of my favorite verses in here is Proverbs 3, 5, and 6, which says this, trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding, but in all your ways acknowledge Him, and He will set your paths straight. This is how we listen. And in this verse, there are four distinct clauses, four distinct aspects of listening. First is that we need to surrender everything to God. From there, we need to go to wise people around us, listen to advice, and submit the mundane things to Christ. And then from there, we will know how to navigate the situations and the decisions in life that we're called to make. And so the first portion, is that we need to trust in the Lord with all our heart. And that's the foundation for the rest of it. But, what does that mean? It's easy to just say Christianese and then move on, but if we're going to be able to apply this, we need to actually know what that means. Well, Proverbs 22:4 says this, humility is the fear of the Lord. Its wages are riches and honor and life. And I was reading through Proverbs, ended about a week ago, and I read that verse, and I automatically thought of the verse in the beginning that says, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. And this verse is saying that humility is the fear of the Lord. So therefore, I would argue that, scripturally speaking, humility and wisdom aren't just two good things. It's not a coincidence that they often go together, because humility leads to wisdom. In fact, there's a verse, I don't remember where, but it says, with humility comes wisdom. So I do believe that in order to increase in wisdom, we need to be humble. And if we're not humble, if we're prideful and we're not submitting everything to Christ, not that we won't lose our salvation, but we are not putting ourselves in a position where God will be able to grow us. And so, humility is necessary. But why is that? Well, first, in order to answer that question, we need to know what humility is. And on the Young Adult Sunday when I talked about John 3, he must increase and I must decrease. And there's three distinct parts of humility that I would argue. The first is the proper view of who God is. And not the simplified version that we often make, because it's easy to unintentionally cut out aspects of God's character, because he is big and so complex that we're not going to be able to know all his facets. But humility starts with a proper view of who God is. Because he is, yes, he is the shepherd, and the good shepherd and the bread of life. And he is relational, and he is loving. But that same God spoke to Job in Job 38. Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? Do you know this? Because we don't. He didn't, and we don't either. He's powerful and mighty. He is the king of this world, and all that we see, every one of us, will belongs to him. And someday we will bend the knee and confess that he is Lord. So humility starts with who God is, but we also need to remember who we are, because we are fallen and we are imperfect. But those of us that have believed in Jesus are also his sons and daughters. We're his new creation. We are a chosen people, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, God's special possession, that we may declare the praises of him who called us out of the darkness and into his glorious light. That is who we are. And so, again, the third aspect of humility, and I'll tie this all together in a second, the third aspect is that we need to remember how far God came down, because he is both transcendent and immediate. He is in the heavens, and he is great and powerful, but he came down in the form of a babe and incarnated himself so that he would experience this thing called life and be able to truly understand what it is through both his omnipotence and experientially. So that's what humility is, and all three aspects need to be there. But what does that have to do with wisdom and trusting in the Lord? Well, for example, if you need to work on your house, let's say you need an electrician work, you don't go to a pet store, you don't go to, McDonald's, you go to an electrician, somebody that theoretically knows what he's doing. Oftentimes you don't go off as strangers' help, someone you know or someone you've been recommended. And you go to them because you trust them. You trust them because you think that they'll do a good job, that they're, qualified to do the thing that you need. And I lost my place. Yes. You go because you trust them, because you trust that they'll do what you need them to do. And you trust that they'll be able to do it because you trust that they're qualified to do so, that they have the experience, the skills, the time to do those things, that they are a person that is able to do that well. You need to know them. And it's the same with God, because if we don't know him, we're not going to be able to trust him. If we're not actively remembering who he is, that he is big and powerful, yes, but that he's personally invested in each of our lives, that he's placed you and me here for a purpose, and he knows that purpose. If we don't remember who God is, we're not going to trust him. Not that we don't know the things intellectually, but we need to be able to recall them in the moments where decisions are need to be made. We need to know who God is to be able to trust him. And that's where humility really comes in, is recognizing who he is and recognizing who we are. Because pursuing wisdom is good and it is commanded, but it isn't easy. We live in a sinful world. We have this sinful flesh that gets in the way. So it's not easy. And it's also not convenient. In the pursuit of Christ, we have to give up things we have to give up things. There's a cost that is paid. And it's easy for me, and I think for other people too, to minimize the cost. Because oftentimes, when the cost is talked about, it's only in terms of bad things, like, I probably shouldn't smoke, or I probably shouldn't, get drunk and stuff like that. Well, you shouldn't. But it's more than that. The cost of following Christ is clear, but we often simplify it. As Proverbs 4:7 says, the beginning of wisdom is this: though it cost all you have, gain understanding. All we have. And that's the tricky part, isn't it? Because we often read into that all good things, or all bad things, all easy things. But that's not what it says. It says all we have. Wisdom isn't cheap. It's difficult and painful. And that includes giving up good things too. And an example of this that I think of is in Elizabeth Elliot, for those of you that have heard of her. She was a college student in 1947 at Wheaton College in Illinois, and she was studying Greek because she wanted to translate the Bible into a new language. And there she met, then it was Elizabeth Howard. Then she met Jim Elliot, another man who was studying Greek and wanted to translate the Bible into a different language. And they met in 1947. And by the time 1948 rolled around, they were deeply in love with one another. There's a couple of books out there that she wrote and other people wrote. And they're fantastic. And it really details how the Lord really brought them together, and the love they had for another was given to them from God. And that was in 1948. But they had to wait 5 years to get married. They were married in 1953. And then, the part that most people know, in 1956, Jim Elliot was speared to death in the jungles of Ecuador by the people he and Elizabeth were trying to reach. That was a good thing. Marriage is good. Christ-like marriage is wonderful. Relationships, love, those are all good things. And yet, Elizabeth and Jim both recognized that they had to give those to Christ, surrender that to his lordship as well. It doesn't mean it costs all we have, even good things. And that cost is hard, but it is worth it. In Passion and Purity, Elizabeth Elliot wrote this. There it is. So long as our idea of surrender is limited to the renouncing of unlawful things, we have never grasped its true meaning. Good things, too, have to be submitted to the lordship of Christ. Because Jesus himself submitted good things to Christ. His relationship with the disciples, his ministry on earth, he also surrendered everything to God. And we are called to be like him. And that means paying a hard cost that we don't always want to pay. Because we like good things. They're blessings. That's why they're good. But if they're outside of their proper time and place, then that's not where the Lord wants. It's not what the Lord wants for us. And in order to be able to give up good things, we need to have a heart of humility. Because there's a distinct difference between a humble and wise person and a smart but proud person. God is not calling us to be knowledgeable and proud. That has devastating consequences, especially in the church. There's all these stories of pastors messing up pretty badly, and church conflict and just division. And I'm not saying I see that here, far from that. But there's a distinct difference between knowledge and pridefulness, and humility and wisdom. And in order to give up those things, those good things, we need to be humble, to recognize that God knows and that He has a plan for us, and to trust in Him. And again, we can only trust if we know the person that we're trusting. He is good, and He loves us, and He has what is best for us. And that's really the foundation of wisdom. Everything else I'm going to talk about is predicated upon having a heart of humility. If we don't have that, if I don't have that, then the last 3 sections of those verses are worthless because the foundation isn't built. And so while cultivating a heart of humility is the foundation, pursuing wisdom is not just an internal process. Far from it. It's an active process that we need to live out in our day-to-day lives. And the second part, leaning not on your own understanding, is the first portion. And it's like, what does that mean? Leaning not on our own understanding. It means that as we go through this life, we recognize who we are. First, that we're finite and that we're sinful. And so, leaning on our own understanding, in terms of our finiteness, we show it by seeking out advice and letting the Word speak, the Bible, because it's easy to read the Bible, but just kind of brush it off and not have an internal heart posture that's really listening to what God wants us to hear. So we don't understand everything. We're finite. That's why we need advice. That's why we need the Word to speak into us. Proverbs 5:1-2 says this, "My son, pay attention to my wisdom. Turn your ear to my words of insight, that you may maintain discretion and your lips may preserve knowledge." Paying attention to wisdom, to other people's wisdom, is necessary. It is vital. And the wonderful thing is that God has given us a fantastic opportunity to do it. Because we're in this thing called church, where there's other people that we know and love and that have been following Christ for a while. And even if you've been following Christ for the same amount of time as another person, maybe there's an area where you need to grow, and God has already grown that person a lot. And so listening to advice, it starts in the home for those of us that have a Christ-like home, a Christian foundation at home. It starts with listening to your parents, because again, they know more than you, and they see things that I don't see in my life as I talk to them about some things. We need not just to know that this is important, but to intentionally seek it out. And this is a never-ending process, seeking out advice and listening to God as He speaks through the Bible. Because this side of heaven, we're never going to be perfect. This side of heaven, there's always more for us to learn. And so we always need to have a heart that seeks out advice. Again, because other people see things that you don't, that I don't. I know that for sure. And I think the other big area in which we need to lean not on our own understanding is by listening to correction. Proverbs 19 verse 20 says this, "Listen to advice and accept discipline, and at the end you will be counted among the wise." Listening to correction is hard. You guys probably know that better than I do. It's hard because we have this pesky thing called sin. And one of those pesky sins is this thing called pride, which means we don't want to listen to correction. But it's vital, not just helpful, not just a good thing to do on the side. It is vital because we are sinful. We're imperfect. We make mistakes. And even when we make those mistakes, if we see that we're making mistakes, we oftentimes minimize or ignore the consequences. And it's only when, either through the Word or through somebody else, through a brother and sister, sometimes God uses those things to tell us to lovingly discipline us and get us back on where we're supposed to be. It's hard, but it's necessary. An example of this from my own life, and it happened earlier this semester, and I don't say this to my pride, but to God's glory and to His praises, because, oh man, I needed it so badly. So I went home on Christmas break, and something you might not know about me is that I like video games. I really, really like video games. Like when I was working for a year for the Abbey, I spent way too much of my time playing video games. And there's this video game that went on sale during Christmas break that I've wanted for a while because it looked awesome, and so I got it, which isn't inherently bad. Not going to turn. My point, though, is that I got back to the Abbey and started playing it way too much. It's called Baldur's Gate 3. And they all laugh because they know exactly where this story is going, because they witnessed it. And it's not inherently bad, but what ended up happening was that I played, for the first 2 weeks of second semester, I played 40 hours of video games each week in the middle of schoolwork and class times and hanging out and, still needing sleep and stuff. I was in a really bad spot. And thankfully, my roommate one night, it was like 2:30 in the morning, and class was at 10, like 7.5 hours later, and I still had to do my homework. It, again, not to my pride, but to God's glory. And my roommate, thank goodness, he was like, Ian, you need to stop. And I knew that internally because I knew that I was tired, both physically and spiritually. But just the fact that he said it was like, you need to stop. You need to uninstall all your games and block YouTube because there's stuff you need to be doing and you're not doing it. And I knew that internally, I recognized that what I was doing was wrong. But just the fact that he said it kind of made everything click. And I did. I uninstalled the games and I blocked YouTube. And so without that, you can ask my classmates later, I was tired, I was annoyed at stuff, I didn't get my homework done. Again, ask them later, they'll tell you, especially my roommate. He saw a lot. It's a good thing he loves me. But listening to correction, if I hadn't listened to that correction, who knows how many more video games I would have played, how much more time I would have spent. So not only did I have to listen to correction in the moment, I had to follow through. Because I could have acknowledged the correction in the moment and then just installed another game 2 or 3 days later and done the exact same thing. So listening to correction not only requires humility in the moment, but in the follow-through. Because if I hadn't followed through, it would have done nothing. I mean, sure, I might have had an emotional high for a day or two because I did something smart. But if I had just fallen into that same sin 2 or 3 days later, it wouldn't really have changed anything. As we listen to correction, we need to follow through. Practically follow through. Because again, this pursuit of wisdom is an active process that we live out. And so I had to actively do the things my roommate said and then resist the temptation to go back. Because I could have. Yeah, I could have. That takes too much time to explain, and it's kind of beside the point. But I needed to resist the temptation to fall into it again. We need to follow through. It's required. If correction is going to do anything, if we're going to be counted among the wise, we need to accept discipline, not understand it. Yes, we need to understand it, but accept it and apply it as well. And then as we apply correction and insight we've received, we need to do so in all our ways. All your ways acknowledge Him. Not some or most, but all our ways. And it's easy to hear that and be like, yeah, all our ways, sweet, easy. And then acknowledge God in only 3 or 4. But James 4, verses 13 through 15 says this, "Now listen, you who say, today or tomorrow, we will go to this or that city, spend a year there, carry on business, and make money. Why? You do not even know what will happen tomorrow. What is your life? You are a mist that appears for a little while and then vanishes. Instead, you ought to say, if it is the Lord's will, we will live and do this or that. And acknowledging in all our ways, acknowledging Christ and listening to correction and advice, it means all. And it sounds self-explanatory when I say that, but I do this too, keep a few things on the side in a little box. It's like, oh, all right, God, over here, you're Lord. Over here, I'll do what you want. But in this little thing, I'm going to do what I want. And it doesn't have to be like jobs. It can be little things like, do you hang out with somebody, When do you do chores? Laundry and all that stuff like that. In all our ways, we need to acknowledge Christ. And we need to do it down to the tiniest details. If in the Old Testament, in Exodus and Numbers and Deuteronomy, one thing that is consistent is that God goes down to the minute when he's talking about how he wants the Israelites to live. Yes, he does say all, the famous stuff about not worshiping idols, but there's the dietary laws and the cleanliness habits and all that stuff. But one of the most detailed passages in the Old Testament is about the tabernacle. In Exodus 26, 15 through 25, it's about the tabernacle, and it's part of the actual structure itself. The tabernacle was that tent that the Israelites set up and where God dwelt while they were wandering in the wilderness. And it consisted of an outer court, and there was like the altar for burnt offerings, something else in the outer court, and then there was a smaller tabernacle like tent itself. And that's where the holy place was and the holiest of holies was. And Exodus 26, 15 through 25, it's about the walls of the actual tent itself. And it says this, make upright frames of acacia wood for the tabernacle. Each frame is to be 10 cubits long and a cubit and a half wide, with 2 projections set parallel to each other. Make all the frames of the tabernacle in this way. Make 20 frames for the south side of the tabernacle, and make 40 silver bases to go under them, 2 bases for each frame, 1 under each projection. For the other side, the north side of the tabernacle, make 20 frames and 40 silver bases, 2 under each frame. Make 6 frames for the far end, that is, the west end of the tabernacle, and make 2 frames for the corners at the far end. At these 2 corners, they must be double from the bottom all the way to the top and fitted into a single ring. Both shall be like that. So there will be 8 frames and 16 silver bases, 2 under each frame. That's just the walls. That says nothing about the borders of the actual courtyard, the altar, the interior, like how it was covered, the curtains inside of it. That's just the walls. And in that portion, there are several characteristics that were laid out. They had to be upright. They had to be 10 cubits long by 1.5 cubits wide. They had to have 2 projections set into each other and like little knobs so that they could fit together, because this is just one board. Also, they had to be plated with gold. It says that a few verses later. And they had to be built in such a way where they could have the 2 silver bases on each of them. And that's just one. There's 20 for the south side, 20 for the north side, and 8 for the west. And again, 2 silver bases per board. So 40 for the south, 40 for the north, and 16 for the west. In total, for just the walls alone, 48 boards and 96 silver bases. That is an incredible amount of detail on each one. And it had to be each one, because they had to fit together to form a cohesive shape. Every single board had to be that detailed. And that was the tabernacle. And the tabernacle means dwelling place, because it's where God's Spirit dwelt in the Old Testament until Solomon built the temple. And that's what we are. It says, I think it's in Ephesians, that we're given the gift of the Holy Spirit upon salvation. God dwells in us. We are his dwelling place in some weird, confusing way. We are his dwelling place. In the Old Testament, for a dwelling place of wood and cloth and gold, he went into that much detail. So when it says, in all our ways acknowledge him, we need to bring it down to the tiniest detail. He went into that much detail to design the tabernacle. Again, a non-living structure. And he has paid so much more for us. He died that we may be with him for all eternity. Why do we think that we don't need to go into that much detail? Why do we think that we can have these little tiny things that God doesn't affect? Why do we think that? We need to be paying attention to the details of what he's doing in our life. And paying attention to those details takes work. Because another thing about the tabernacle was that they had to tear it down and set it up every day. And there's a whole lot of stuff there. Acknowledging Christ in the tiniest of details, it takes work and time. And it requires humility, recognizing that it needs to be done and that God knows better than us. And so that's the command of those verses. But there's a promise at the end. Trust in the Lord with all your heart, and lean not on your own understanding, but in all your ways acknowledge him, and he will set your path straight. It means that if the first three things are done, that he will lead us into the fullness of life that he wants for us. Yes, there's a cost, and I don't mean to minimize it, but I also want to make sure we're not minimizing the abundant life that God wants to give us, because he does want to give it to us. But if we don't have humility through trusting in him and listening to advice and correction and letting him be the Lord of the details, we're going to settle. We'll settle for less than the fullness of life that God wants to give for us. Because if we don't surrender things, not that we won't lose our salvation, but God's just going to let us wander until we come to that point of surrendering that thing. And then once we surrender that thing, he'll lead us into the fullness of life. And it is that fullness of life which we cannot forget, because that's the prize. That's what we gain. And Jesus himself ran with his eye on the prize, ran thinking about you and me. He walked the road to Calvary, and he died thinking of you and me, thinking of the prize. We need to remember, how great and wonderful the prize is. And everything that I've said until now, all it does is position you to hear from the Lord, having a heart of humility, all the things I've said, 3, 5, and 6. It positions you to hear from the Lord. But I can't do it for you. There has to be personal application. I can't listen to the Lord's will for you. Pastor Jeff cannot listen to the Lord's will for me. We can do it with each other and alongside one another, but there has to be personal application for me as well. And so, personal application. And I'm going to be honest, I didn't think of how to transition to communion, but that's what we're doing next. So, yay.